June 9th, 2020, Ethiopia, Egypt and Sudan resumed talks over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which have been stalled since February 2020. The new round of talks held virtually due to COVID-19 among the three countries' ministers of water and irrigation saw agreement on guidelines for the first stage of filing and operating the GAD and on safety rules. However, the dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia over the controversial dam is far from resolution. Had the recent round led to better outcomes, the impact of GAD on the bilateral relationship between Cairo and Addis Ababa would still be significant for the foreseeable future. How did this dispute of Egypt and Ethiopia started? Tension and dispute over the Nile River's water have been ongoing for decades. Relationship among the Nile Basin 10 countries are governed by a set of treaties and agreements signed during the 20th century, that is 1902, 1929 and 1959, and are commonly known as the Nile River Agreement. They stipulate that the upstream riparian states, mainly Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda and Ethiopia, have to respect the right of the downstream countries, that is mainly Egypt and Sudan, regarding the Nile's water. In addition, they are prohibited from building dams or launching construction projects on the river without the approval of the downstream countries, particularly Egypt. Not only have these treaties guaranteed Egypt's shares of the Nile water over the past century and enable it to achieve its developmental and agricultural plans, particularly after building the Aswan High Dam in the early 1960s, but they also gave Cairo and Khartoum veto power over any construction plan or project that might affect their share of the water. These agreements were always contested and challenged by the upstream riparian states, while Egypt and Sudan insist that their shares of water should be respected and honored. The upstream riparian state believe that these agreements are unfair and impede their agriculture and development plans. They reason that they are not bound by this agreement as they were signed by colonial powers and their government were not part of such accords. As the population of the Nile River Basin countries have been growing rapidly during the past decades, their developmental needs have increased, adding tension and disagreement among them. Attempts at negotiation for governing and sharing the Nile water did not stop during the past 3 decades. In 1999, the Nile Basin countries reached an agreement, that is Nile Basin Initiative, that aimed to enhance their cooperation. It brought together all countries that have access to the Nile River to establish trust among them and make effective and beneficial use of the river for all parties. The NBI was a hallmark accord for the basin state as it aimed to create an inclusive framework for governing the river's water. It also outlined the establishment of a cooperative framework took almost a decade. So in 2010, the CFA was established and it introduced for the first time the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization of the Nile River water. But it was signed by only 6 countries, that is Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya and Burundi, and was vehemently rejected by Egypt and Sudan, because it doesn't respect their historical and acquired right to the Nile. Ethiopia interprets the CFA treaty as replacing the earlier Nile River agreements and creating new realities that should be accepted by Egypt and Sudan. Since then, the relationship between Egypt and Ethiopia has become strained and tense. Ethiopia's plan to build the GAD date back to the 1960s, but they were postponed for political and economic reasons. The country suffers from lack of electricity and development despite its massive water resources. With its 112 million population, Ethiopia relies heavily on the GAD to enhance its economic and improve its people's lives. The dam would secure electricity for the power-starved nation and could both fuel economic development and bring in cash through international electricity sales. Around 85% of the water that flow into the Nile River comes from Ethiopia Islands through the Blue Nile, on which Ethiopia is building its dam. Therefore, Egypt views the GAD as the essential threat. The reservoir behind the GAD, once filled, will hold about 70% of water Nile that flows into Egypt's Aswan High Dam. Currently, water insecurity is perhaps the most serious threat to Egypt. Should the GAD be filled without an agreement, Egypt will face a risk of drought conditions and losing more than 1 million jobs and about $1.8 billion in economic production each year. Ethiopia planned on filling the dam in 6 years, which started in July 2020. The longer it takes to fill the dam, the less this will impact the already struggling supply of the Nile's water in Egypt. However, Egypt would like Ethiopia to extend this time to 12 to 21 years so that the level of the river does not drop rapidly. The United States made effort to mediate between Egypt, Sudan and Ethiopia in order to resolve the dispute over the GAD. Washington attempts to use its economic and financial pressure to push them to resolve their dispute. So Ethiopia withdrew from the talk. Ethiopia analysts believed that Washington always sides with Egypt, and any agreement on the GAD would tie Ethiopia's hand. So in the next video, we will be able to see River Nile meandering into the Aswan High Dam.